Good morning and welcome to the last breakout session for History Camp Iowa. My name is Jennifer Cooley and it's great to have you with us this morning. This session is all about a sensation that never equaled, arson and murder in Walford with Kate Levasseur. Kate is a history enthusiast by both hobby and trade. A lifelong Des Moines area resident, she has spent the last 10 years working in area museums and sharing programs with the public just like this one. So Kate, I'm very happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Like I said to you earlier, it's our fourth presentation together since this pandemic started, so it's very exciting to continue that partnership. So, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming. Hopefully we'll have some history enthusiasts and true crime enthusiasts today to join us. So. Just a little note before we begin today, there is a lot of material on this story. So to condense it down into the time slot we have together today was very challenging. So one of the ways I decided to center the story was to present it through primary source documents or portions of primary source documents. So a lot of what I will be sharing with you today is taken directly from the Cedar Rapids Gazette as the news was unfolding. And this will not only give you kind of an exciting way to hear the story, but it will illustrate the way an Iowan would have heard about these events obviously in a time decades before the 24-hour news cycle or the internet. So it should also be noted that this was a time where journalism was tended to be sensationalized. So we'll take things a little bit with a grain of salt. And I'm also going to add, just for some contextual information right now before we start, that much like today, where true crime ends up being the focus of television channels, internet blogs, true crime actually started, especially murder, was very popular as reading material in both England and the United States at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. So audiences would have been very excited to see these stories and read about them and get all the details. So mostly, like I said, it will be information from the Cedar Rapids Gazette for the first half of the presentation, and any information from other sources I will note. Also for reference, for those of you joining us that aren't familiar with Walford or the Cedar Rapids area, this is obviously a modern map of Cedar Rapids. You can see Walford there down to the southwest of Cedar Rapids. Today, according to Google Maps, it's approximately a 20-minute drive. And depending which way you take, anywhere from about 11 to 15 miles using modern roads between Cedar Rapids and Walford. But that just gives you a little bit of a frame of reference while we talk about the story here. All right, time to jump in. The Crime and Inquest. So the story first appears in the paper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, on Wednesday, February 3rd. Frank Novak perished in the flames this morning, was the headline, by the burning of his store building in which he was sleeping. Frank Novak, a young man well known and highly respected in the city, lost his life at Walford early this morning. And I won't necessarily read everything to you here, but these are kind of the parts I felt were most important to telling this story. So in addition to Frank Novak's death or alleged death, it was also noted that another gentleman from the Walford area, Ed Murray, was also missing. There wasn't a coroner's inquest held, and it was decided that the charred remains could not be 100% identified as those of Mr. Novak, and everyone really became suspicious of foul play. So it was rumored here and believed by Mr. Novak's friends that the disappearance of Murray is directly due to his part in the awful tragedy. Whether Murray undertook and did rob the store, murder Mr. Novak, and burn the building to conceal his crime can only be conjectured, but it was hinted at here this afternoon. And so just for some additional information from what would have appeared in the paper that day, At this point, they said no one had seen Novak after 8:00 p.m., so the night before, so the night of February 2nd. At 1 a.m., February 3rd, the building was on fire and it could not be extinguished. And in daylight, the search began, and that's when they found the charred remains in the basement. They could not tell how the fire started or how the person died. And though, like I said, though they assumed the remains to be Novak's, the identity could not be positively determined. This was an image of Frank Novak that appeared in the paper. At this point, photography was rapidly growing in popularity, but photographs were seldom used in daily newspapers. So most of the sketches you'd see would be just that, sketches of people of importance to the story. Thursday, February 4th, the remains are claimed by both. The mystery is deepened by the finding of an identification check worn by Novak on his suspenders. So this, as a side note, would just be just a little tag that would have been on his clothing that would identify him, which is on the cot with the remains. Murray wore a colony blue shirt, and a sister claims to have found a remnant of such cloth near the armpit on the body recovered. Either is a strong circumstance, and it will be for the coroner and court to decide. In the meantime, there may be something about the teeth, some defect or peculiarity that will afford absolute identity, or at least decide the case as between the claimants for the remains. Elsewhere in the article, you start seeing a shadow of a motive starting to emerge. Novak had $33,000 in accident and life insurance policies, and the paper noted that this is an amount that a man of very good income might find inconvenient or impossible to carry. The life insurance companies will contest payment. Now, the paper also mentioned that by this day, so this would have been, the day after the story initially broke, the large insurance was a motive for the crime, and that was openly being discussed amongst the town. Murray, meanwhile, more sketches of his character were starting to emerge, and how these people described Edward Murray to kind of reminded me of Muff Potter in Tom Sawyer. So it was always reported whenever they talk about him that he loved liquor and that he was constantly drunk, but there seemed to be kind of this community feeling that he was inoffensive and not very bright. So he definitely wasn't seen as a villain, so to speak. Continuing that day, also, we start seeing the introduction of some unique evidence in identifying the body. The article noted the teeth on Novak's upper jaw had been treated by a dentist. So there was a bridge that had been put in because he had had a missing tooth. And though the dentist in Cedar Rapids who had done the work originally was no longer in Cedar Rapids, another dentist had done some repair work when it had become loose. And so the second dentist who they contacted had forgotten which exact tooth it was he had worked on. But he did offer some insight into what the dental work would have looked like. And it was also noted that there was gold that had been used in the bridge, and that actually Novak had taken that to a jeweler in town. And while the jeweler was initially hesitant to repair that gold work, since none of them had worked on dental equipment before, he told them he wouldn't hold them liable for it, and they ended up repairing it. So this jewelry company also had employees saying that if it was found, they would be able to identify whether it was Frank Novak's bridge work or not. And it says at the end there, it is not known in the city whether Murray's teeth had been similarly treated. Murray's sister did claim that the dental work on the remaining teeth, matched her brother's, 2 missing bicuspids with a bridged molar. So by Friday, February 5th, the newspaper headlines read, all parties concerned are agreed that the man found in the ruins at Walford was murdered by the one who is missing. The only means of proof are scraps of clothing and the dental work. theories advanced as to reason for retaining the $500. Now, this is a piece of evidence that popped up on February 5th during the inquest. Normally, Novak sent the money to be his money from the store that he owned, the store that had burned, to a bank in Cedar Rapids, along with the bank book. But for whatever reason, he had accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, kept the $500 that was meant to be deposited. And he was heard to have said this in front of Edward Murray. So people beyond Novak knew that he had $500 on him, but no one knew for sure whether he had kept it on purpose or it had just been a mistake. There was a big break regarding the dental work on Friday, February 5th. Rumor testimony, because the inquest was closed, so the press actually couldn't attend. So reporters were relying on people who were in the room to be able to give them information. But the reporters said that a reputable party who overheard the testimony of Hasek, who had actually been the dental assistant that had done the work, he came forward. He said that he had testified that the two upper bicuspids on the left side were gone in Frank Novak, but that upon examination of the skull of the charred remains found in the store, there was one bicuspid and the stump of another. So he said, to the best of his knowledge, it was not the body of Frank Novak based on the dental evidence or forensic dentistry of the body. There was also continued, just before February 6th, there was some continued discussion of Novak's financial difficulties, and there was some speculation that he was about to default on those insurance policies due to being unable to pay the premiums, or he would have to declare bankruptcy. So the motives continued to be found, pointing to financial difficulties and a need for an insurance payout to cover them on Novak's part. So once we get to Saturday, February 6th, we get the result of the coroner's inquest. The coroner's jury decides that it was the body of Ed Murray found in the ruins, and the remains are turned over to his family. Both Novak and the Murray families had been attempting to claim the remains as being those of their family member. Novak's family still believe he was lost in the fire, but detectives will search for him on the theory of murder and arson. There were some people that did believe that there could have been another body that was totally destroyed in the fire, which is why there was no evidence of it. It says that at the bottom there, the article noted that while the verdict of the jury does not even intimate that Frank Novak is the murderer, that person is missing, and the public will hold him guilty of the crime until he has been returned to the scene and the tragedy proves beyond all question of a doubt his innocence. So at this point, the hunt is on. What happened to Frank Novak if it is indeed Ed Murray's body that was found in the store? Monday, February 8th, it's published in the paper that Frank Novak was seen south of Homestead. So this is not terribly far from Walford after the fire. So the next morning, so even though this article was published February 8th, they're referring back to events that would have happened February 3rd. So it said Novak stopped at George A. Crissinger's home and asked for coffee and breakfast. He was carrying a gun and was in hunter's garb. And reporters were guessing that he was keeping to country places and villages. The reporters went on to say that the theory that Murray was made intoxicated before he was murdered is well borne out by the statement of Mr. Crissinger, who said that the smell of liquor was very strong upon Mr. Novak's breath and that he appeared to have been on an all-night debauch. The next day, another clue appears. It was Novak, John Bryson, who hauled the stranger to Williamsburg last Thursday night, so that would be referencing the week before, is in town today and claims to recognize the stranger as Frank Novak from the picture in the Gazette. He was to receive $6, but the stranger gave him $7. He got here about 10 o'clock, no further trace of him since. He had on a light-colored hunting coat. On Monday, February 15th, it has been established at this point that there is a reward that's going to be offered for Novak's capture. The Iowa governor, Francis Drake, is putting up a $500 reward, and Benton City Sheriff Metcalf offered a $200 reward. They also had discovered, or it had been discovered, that Novak had left Walford with a lot more money than anyone knew, or at least he had been in possession of more money than anyone knew before the fire. Due to the reporters investigating, it was determined that he had borrowed several $1,000s, both among his friends, and when it says those of his own nationality in this city, Novak's family were Czech immigrants. So he was born in the United States, or Bohemian, as they would have said at this point in time. There is, for those not familiar with Cedar Rapids, there's a strong Czech community there. One gentleman in the South End mourns his departure to the extent of $1,200, another $1,000, another $500, and it is reported that there are a number of others caught for like amounts. It also did note, however, that the friends of the missing murderer now set up the claim that Ed Murray has been seen at Watkins since the night of the tragedy and identified. This is in effect an admission that Frank Novak is also missing and that the body found in the debris is that of some unknown person. The truth of this theory is doubted in all quarters, but granting for the sake of argument, should any effort be spared in the capture of Frank Novak, and is anyone justified in helping him to escape? There is a lot of speculation, and this is contextual information from me and clarification, that Frank Novak was hiding amongst property of his relatives in Benton County. There was a lot of wooded area his family owned, so no one, since there had been no sign of him, people figured that someone had to be helping him if he had not left the state. At this point, the trail begins to grow cold. No one can find him and no one has any clues. Saturday, February 27th, so over 3 weeks after the murder and the fire, a Gazette reporter was confidentially informed this afternoon that it is positively known that Frank Novak sailed for Europe yesterday. If this is true, the name of the ship that he sailed on is also known, and he will undoubtedly be arrested as soon as he lands on the other side of the big water. There was no further information on this because it ended up being a false lead. Then we go a whole nother month before getting any other information. Wednesday, March 24th, you see in the Cedar Rapids Gazette a note that absolutely nothing is known here as to the route covered by Novak in his dash for liberty. It was thought for some time that he had gone to Europe. It was also thought that he had gone west, and parties stated positively that he had been seen at Omaha. This, however, proved to be a tale rising from a diseased imagination. At this point, in addition to general curiosity about where Novak has gone, there is still a lot of people thinking that one or both of them were involved in an insurance scheme, that a lot of people thought that Murray was still alive, and Novak's family was also firm believers in the fact that he had actually passed away. And one of the reasons this was important is because Novak had actually been running a sort of bank out of his store. And so there were a lot of people, including the insurance companies with whom he had claims, that were wanting to sue him to get their money back, or the family, that is. So he had essentially left his father, his widowed sister-in-law, widowed sister, who was a partner in his business, his niece, as well as his wife and 2 sons with no resources, no money. So the family didn't want him to be dead, both for personal reasons and because if he had died, then they would indeed be owed the insurance money that would have helped all of them survive. Then, after several months, amazingly, the story breaks. Novak is captured, the paper said August 27th. The escaped Walford murderer was taken at Dawson City in the Klondike region, where he was playing the violin in a dance hall. Story of the pursuit that began in Iowa City terminated in British Northwest Territory. Sought escape by traveling under false names. Chinese merchant who was his roommate to Juneau gave important information, which resulted in operatives surrounding the gold region. Frank Novak is the man arrested under the name of William Smith. So what happened? It has been a long time since anyone had heard anything or had any clues, and suddenly Frank Novak is arrested in Alaska. So the next section is not going to be information taken from the Cedar Rapids Gazette, unless I mention it, because as we know from what we just looked at, the Cedar Rapids Gazette had no idea what was happening to him during this time period. So where this information is coming from is actually from the report of a detective from the Teal Detective Agency. And if you're familiar with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, it was very similar in that it was a private detective agency, and the insurance companies had actually hired this detective agency to track Novak down so they could prove that they did not have to pay out on their policies. So the information here is coming from the reports and correspondence sent from their detectives to the head of the agency there, and that were communicated to the county attorneys and law enforcement as necessary. So it says, it was determined that after leaving the Christinger farm, Novak made his way to Iowa City, where he bought a ticket west. He was spotted, but this lead was not pursued by local investigators. As you can recall from the newspaper, it said that this report was the product of a diseased mind. However, they were correct. He was traced to Omaha, where he purchased a train ticket to Portland. He signed to this ticket F.A. Smith, and a copy of the signature was sent to Cedar Rapids for comparison to Novak's signatures, and it was eventually matched to his handwriting. It was further discovered Novak arrived in Portland on February 12th, then traveled on to Port Townsend and Seattle, Washington. Aboard the Alki. No, on February 23rd, Novak departed Seattle for Juneau on the steamer Alki, arriving in Juneau on March 4th. While on the steamer to Juneau, Novak continued using the alias J.A. Smith and traveled with a Chinese merchant named Lu Gong. Both drank heavily and gambled most of the voyage. While Novak continued wearing the same clothes that he had escaped wearing, that hunting garb, it was noted by a lot of people that he did wear a gold ring with a diamond, but that he often turned the setting to the inside of his hand, whether to disguise the value or because it had a sentimental reason. They weren't sure, but that was something that was noted by both the crew and passengers that had returned and were interviewed by detectives. In Alaska, it was Novak fell in with a group of miners headed to the Klondike. So he left with this group, and some miners were already starting to return by the time they were interviewed by detectives. And they told the detectives that they had seen him in Dawson City, him being Novak, playing the violin in a dance hall. At this point, they took a pause because detectives had not heard whether or not Novak was a violin player. But once they confirmed with their sources back in Iowa City area, back in Walford, Cedar Rapids, that he was indeed a violin player, detectives felt confident that they had found him. Now, the tricky thing is, of course, since he had left the state of Iowa, there was paperwork that needed to be filled out. So Iowa Governor Francis Drake issued a warrant of extradition to the governor of Alaska. And the detective that had now been placed in charge of the case for the Teal Detective Agency, Red Perrin, left Seattle for Juneau on April 4th with a warrant signed by President McKinley to be sent after him. Upon arriving in Juneau, this part really is crazy to me. Detective Perrin was met with a message directing him to travel to Ottawa to explain extradition papers in case Novak had crossed into Canada. And this was a concern because since he had been reportedly seen in Dawson City, that was definitely in Canada. So, which at that time was British territory. So they definitely needed more paperwork. So he had to travel from Juneau, Alaska to Ottawa, which if you're not familiar with the geography of Canada, that's definitely more towards the east side of Canada. And then get the paperwork and then come back to the West Coast. So he didn't actually arrive until back in Juneau with the paperwork he needed until May 24th. And then he had to check in with the governor of Alaska in Sitka to make sure that he had everything he needed. So essentially, from the time he first arrived in Juneau, it was about 6 weeks until he actually had, Detective Perrin actually had all the administrative tasks taken care of that he needed to arrest Novak, which of course is a lot of time for Novak to disappear if he hadn't already. I know this has been a pretty text-heavy presentation just because there weren't a lot of images being published in papers, or people weren't just taking pictures with their phone all the time. But I did want to include a map here to give you a little bit of an idea of where things are that I'm going to be talking about. So you can see Seattle, Washington there kind of in the middle. And the route that was taken most often to get up to Juneau, you can see they followed along the coast, and Juneau is there kind of in the panhandle of Alaska underneath Canada there. You also see a town called Andaya and next to Skagway there, and that is going to be where everyone is going to be setting off for Dawson City, which you can see is north there. There's a big red dot. And I know, Jennifer, that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to be efficient. Perrin travels to the Yukon. So this is the most wild part of Perrin's journey to me. So he decides that this is going to be challenging to do himself. So he joins forces with a Norwegian carpenter named Knudsen, and together they depart Juneau on June 7th. It should not have been a long trip to Daya, probably a few hours, but it took 2 days because of bad weather. And they then had to take the Chilkoot Trail to Lake Lindeman, and a journey that normally was done in 3 to 6 days, they completed in 23 hours. So they were exhausted, but it was still very early in their trip. June 14th, the men cut down several trees and spent the next couple days building a boat, which they named the Viking. After crossing Lake Bennett, the Viking passed a scow, which is kind of a flat-bottomed barge. And the men on each ship shouted greetings to one another as they discovered they were both headed to Dawson City. In an unbelievable coincidence, Novak was a passenger on that scow, but he was not identified since Perrin believed him to already be in Dawson City. And to me, this is the craziest coincidence in the entire story. So Knudsen and Perrin continued their journey down the Yukon River to Dawson City. And after an extremely dangerous 600-mile journey and with no sign of Novak, they arrived in Dawson City on July 1st. That journey was published in a lot more detail in Perrin's journal, which was later published in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and also in a book I'll tell you about at the end if you want to know more. Here's just a couple of pictures that give you an idea. These are not pictures of anyone in this case. They're actually from the following year when the Klondike really picked up. But on the left is prospectors traveling up on the Chilkoot Trail to Chilkoot Pass. And on the right would be kind of a generic example of one of the scows or the flat bottom barge boats that these men would have been using to travel up the Yukon River. Once they actually reached Dawson City, it took 2 weeks of looking around before Perrin even got any leads, because it turns out that Novak was not there. He met a newly arrived scow, on July 12th. And as the crew and men were coming off the ship, he spotted Novak, though he had a full beard and confronted him. Novak, unsurprisingly, claimed to be J.A. Smith of Chicago, but since Perrin had spent time there, he asked him some very specific questions, which Novak could not answer. So Perrin asked him to sign his name and then match the writing to a sample of Novak's he had brought with him. Perrin then took Novak to Inspector Constantine of the Northwest Mounted Police. In addition to the handwriting sample, Perrin had brought Novak's dental records because so much had been made of them in the identification of the body. And he was examined by a doctor that was in the area, and it was a match. The final proof, again with a big coincidence here, the final proof was identification by a man in Dawson City who had done business in Walford and instantly recognized Novak without any prompting. So with this proof, Constantine ordered his arrest. And then they began the trip back to Iowa. Accompanied by down the river by a retiring Mountie, Perrin and Novak reached the port town of St. Michael on July 21st. So they did not actually go back the way they came. They took the Yukon River actually west towards the coast of Alaska, the west coast there, to the port town of St. Michael on July 21st. They had to wait another 2 weeks before another boat even came to pick them up. And then due to bad weather, they actually couldn't even leave St. Michael until August 16th. Upon reaching the United States, Perrin sent a telegram to his boss. A savvy reporter noticed that telegram, broke the story, and news of Novak's apprehension appeared in newspapers on August 27th, as we saw. Perrin, Novak, and another Teal detective, Klaus, boarded a train for St. Paul, Minnesota, arriving September 1st. A reporter from the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette boarded the train with them in St. Paul and interviewed Novak. They arrived in Benton at 2:30 a.m., and Novak was taken to the Benton County Jail. Just to give you some scope here, Detective Perrin ended up traveling over 20,000 miles between April and August of 1897 in his pursuit of Novak. And obviously you can see April, he didn't even start at the beginning of the case, and he still traveled that far. And just to give you a reminder there, so you can see the red dot of Dawson City, they started there, and as they're going home, they traveled the river following that orange arrow west to the town of St. Michael, and then followed that labeled all-water route back to the United States. So the big question is, did he do it? While in Alaska, he did confess to Detective Perrin twice. So Perrin wrote up the confession, but told Novak that he would keep it quiet unless he needed to tell someone, which was very possible. And this confession was later printed in the paper. So I didn't reproduce the whole thing just for the sake of tiny letters. But the confession that Novak made, it was that basically said it was an accident. He said that Murray did go into the store with him, and while Novak was in the basement, Murray found a bottle of whiskey, which actually had been dosed with morphine. Novak had done this because he had been robbed twice, and each time the thieves had taken some of his whiskey. So he thought he could drug them and trap them or punish them. So Murray took a drink of this drugged whiskey, and when Novak then found him, Murray took the drink, and when Novak found him, he found that partly empty bottle, and Murray was described as being in a stupid condition, so he went upstairs and put Murray to bed. Novak fell asleep, and when he woke up sometime during the night, the store was on fire with a flame shooting out of the hatchway from the basement. He made a couple of efforts to get to Murray to rescue him, but failed as the whole store was being rapidly enveloped in flames. He made it outside and walked around the building several times, his first intention being to raise an alarm, but he realized that Murray was dead, and here's our journalistic flourish, or maybe the flourish of the time, that life had no allurements for himself. He turned and fled, resolving to drop into oblivion where he would never be heard from again. I knew I would run out of time, and the trial and sentencing and his time in prison deserve much more attention than I can give them, but obviously I have to tell you the end of the story. So Novak was indicted on the charge of first-degree murder on September 23rd. His trial began November 9th. The jury was ordered to retire on November 23rd, and Novak was found guilty of murder in the second degree after nearly 12 hours of deliberation, and the jury recommended 10 years at hard labor for his sentence. November 29th, Novak's attorneys filed a motion for a new trial, which was argued on December 4th. Judge Burnham overruled the motion and sentenced Novak that very day, and he actually gave a life sentence at hard labor, and he began the sentence on December 31st of that year. And just to finish out his life, and actually it seemed as though the judge regretted his harsh sentence, and it seemed like generally people believed Novak, at least partially believed Novak's version of events from his confession. November 23rd, 1908, Iowa Governor Cummins commuted his sentence to 25 years with early release due to good behavior, and he was released September 3rd, 1911. During this time when he was in jail, his wife divorced him, and she moved into Cedar Rapids with their 2 children. October 30th, 1911, Novak marries Miss Ella M. Johnson, and they reside in Chicago, where Novak had begun working in real estate. April 17th, 1918, Ella Novak dies. And on July 12th, 1930, Frank Novak dies in Chicago at the age of 65 and is buried with his family in Cedar Rapids. Another great resource for this is the book Skull in the Ashes, Murder, a Gold Rush Manhunt, and the Birth of Circumstantial Evidence in America by Peter Kaufman. It's got a lot of information. So I did use it for some of the timelines for the part in the Klondike, and I highly recommend it. I think at one point it was being sold on Amazon for $3 for the paperback. So it's definitely easy to get a hold of, and it gives you a lot more information than I was able to provide today. And Jennifer, that's a wrap.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. We do have one question, and it's what led you to first learning about this event?
Jennifer, you actually get part credit and you don't even know. I was looking up potential topics for programs I could suggest for doing with the State Historical Society. And this, I came across a summary of this story. I believe it was in the Annals of Iowa, on the database of Annals of Iowa that the University of Iowa has. So it blew my mind. I think I was really just amazed at this story and that I'd never heard of it before, because it just seems like a movie. So I actually didn't know that this Skull in the Ashes book existed, and I got really excited that maybe it could be my big break. But then of course someone else had found the story. But that's great, because then I got to read all the work they had done and still learn the story, without having to travel to Ottawa, though that could be fun too.
That could be very fun. Well, Kate, thank you so much. And we also had a suggestion of submitting this to the My Favorite Murder podcast. That could be your big break.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, Kate, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody joining us today. The ending session, the closing session will begin here in just a few minutes. So we hope to be able to see you there. Thanks again.